Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you who have joined us and are present in this room today. I would like to extend my appreciation to Professor Yvonne Sherwood for preparing the lecture, as well as to the workshop participants and guests who have gathered here today. As this event marks my farewell at IVM, since my fellowship is concluding, I would also like to express my gratitude to my dear colleague, right in the back, Ludger Hagedorn, for all his help and friendly support, and to the artist, Daniel Doming, my friend, for enhancing my project with his visualizations and images. And let me tell you right now that Daniel will be moving a bit around and taking some pictures for the internal purposes, so please, no charges of the IVM or me or Daniel. It's just among us. Thank you for making this event possible. Jacques Derrida, in his contribution to the Religion and Media volume, titled "Above All, No Journalists," offers an interesting interpretation of the binding of Isaac, about which we will delve into both this evening and tomorrow. He underscores the significance of silence and secrecy surrounding the event of binding of Isaac. It is a religious occurrence, a private covenant between God and Abraham, and it is not meant for public dissemination. Above all, no journalists. Their presence would have marred the sanctity of the event. Years prior, and particularly with the proliferation of COVID-19, these kinds of events, such as academic conferences and lectures, have become increasingly common in an online format. This enables people to participate from everywhere, at any time, bridging geographical distances and overcoming physical limitations, economic constraints, and time restrictions. However, this convenience comes at the cost of genuine, embodied, and multisensory shared experience during these events. Nevertheless, even the age-old human need to participate in social events is evolving with Generation Z, for whom an event often feels real only once they have been posted and on social media and harvested likes and shares. I am not making fun of them. I simply acknowledge that I belong to a different generation. I am older. And it is important for me to be physically present here with you in this room now. Here I am. The concept of this event have been continuously evolving since the workshop titled Doomed to Sacrifice that I and Ludger organized together 2 years ago. During that workshop, we delved into questions related to gendered sacrifice in Kierkegaard and the ontological difference in self-sacrifice, interpreted by Jan Patočka. However, what remained deeply etched in my memory was the discussion surrounding the birthing body and the issue of agency. We engaged in lively discussions during coffee breaks and lunch, exploring the idea of the body being nailed to the spot, as per Levinas, versus a body that is fully aware of its needs and timing. I am pleased to note that many papers that are going to be presented in this workshop and lecture are increasingly focusing on the embodied experience of sacrifice as well. But for now, I have been talking already too long, and it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker of tonight, Yvonne Sherwood. Please would you join us, Yvonne? So Yvonne Sherwood has taught for 30 years in British universities, such as King's College London, the University of Glasgow. And she also founded, if I am not mistaken, the Biblical Studies Department at the University of Kent. She has been the recipient of fellowships and grants from the British Academy, was the 2015 Speakers Lecturer at the University of Oxford, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Oslo in 2017, where she acts as a visiting professor until today. Among her published works belongs Biblical Blaspheming, Trials of the Sacred for a Secular Age, which was shortlisted for the American Academy of Awards for Excellence Book Prize. The Invention of the Biblical Scholar, a critical manifesto co-authored with Stephen DeMoore in 2011, which I also cite in my dissertation thesis. And the Bible and Feminism, Remapping the Field, 2017. Yvonne Sherwood, on the personal, not personal but professional, but for me personal, is particularly significant for me, for her contribution to connecting biblical studies with philosophy, theology, and beyond, and by incorporating deconstruction and the works of Jacques Derrida into the field of biblical studies. She has been working on topics of sacrifice, religion, and secularization. Dear Yvonne Sherwood, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that incredibly generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here in person, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions tomorrow. So you should all have a copy of 3 handouts of incredibly rich texts that I'm not going to be able to do justice to, but at least touch on during the presentation. So my title today is Sacrifice and Natality, Surrogacy Structures. So I want to begin with one of Soren Kierkegaard or Johannes de Silentio's many beginnings in Fear and Trembling, the section called Attunement, Tuning Up, or Atmosphere, which comes as the second of no less than 4 beginnings. This second preface, which itself fractures into 4 failed beginnings or false starts, recounts the attempts of a certain man who's obsessed with the biblical story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, and who reads and reads aloud, delineates the whole story, cuts it out in paper silhouettes, and performs it over and over again, doing nothing else. With each mental assault, he loses his grip and tumbles back to base camp. Unfortunately for him, and this is Kierkegaard's joke and not mine, he lacks the proper tools to master all that happened on Mount Moriah, because he is just a poor existing individual, not a biblical exegete who knows Hebrew, or a philosophical theologian, or a trained professional mountaineer. The version of the Attunement section, published in 1843, presents 4 trial runs of the trial. But Kierkegaard continued making many more Abraham doodles and expansions in the journals for many years. To give just some hints of the Beckett-like performances of the sacrifice sketched by Soren Johannes, Isaac clings to his father's knees, pleads at his feet, begs for his young life, his fair promise. Or Abraham's eyes turn wild, his expression chill, his venerable locks bristling like furies on his head, grabbing Isaac by the chest, drawing his knife and hissing, "Foolish boy, you thought I was going to do this because of God, but you're wrong. This is my desire. I am worse than a cannibal." Or everything runs smoothly and perfectly, exactly as scripted in the Bible, and yet either Abraham or Isaac, but never both together, always apart, find themselves in some desolate place beyond joy and beyond belief. The numerous Abraham variations in the journals include an Abraham who is deaf or undecided. Is it not working? The numerous Abraham variations in the journals include an Abraham who's deaf or undecided at the crucial moment, actually killing the son and forcing God to appear in visible form and say, "What have you done, you poor old man? You were my friend and I merely wanted to test your faith. Didn't you hear me shouting, 'Abraham, Abraham, stop'?" An even stranger, this is my favorite, an Abraham who would rather God had changed him into a horse or a centaur. If it had pleased you, O Lord, to let me be changed into a horse, yet remaining human, I would be no more at variance with what it is to be a man than I have become through what has just happened. Like the certain man, I've been haunted by these Abraham variations since I first wrote on them back in 2000 for a collection and conference called Bodies in Question. The tuning up seems determined to produce disharmony and discord and heavy pointed silence. Abraham variations more in the style of John Cage, Stockhausen or Webern than Kierkegaard's beloved Mozart. Even more jarring and remarkable are the disruptive, intrusive presences of the double mothers, Sarah and Hagar, and the 4 elliptical poetic monologues that mark the passage from one absurdist, dysfunctional Abraham drama to the next. So Abraham leaves early in the morning, just as in the Hebrew Bible, but then, quote, Sarah watches the father and son from the window until she can see them no more. Alternatively, Abraham embraces Sarah, the bride of his old age, or in another version, the young mother. And Sarah kisses Isaac, her delight, her joy forever, the son who had taken her disgrace from her, who was her pride and hope for generations. And then, as he rides up Mount Moriah, Abraham is haunted by guilt over Hagar and the son, whom he's just driven out into the desert. In the journals, Soren can't keep adding yet more movements that could and perhaps should be made around the mothers. Perhaps even one more move could be made, he writes. Let Sarah get to know about it and let her make an objection. And Abraham cannot discuss this with Sarah. She must regard the journey to Moriah as the most horrible crime against her. And perhaps another Abraham hopes for a time when her wrath will subside and she will forgive him. And if so, he will be humbly grateful for this loving forgiveness. This persistent emphasis on the double mothers is amplified in 4 soliloquies, where the weaning of a child is described as blackening the breast, black milk, and covering the virgin breast. Now, I know that we're going to talk a lot more about these tomorrow, so this is just an opening, just a preface. When the child is to be weaned, the mother blackens her breast, for it would be a shame were the breast to look pleasing when the child is not to have it. So the child believes that the breast has changed, but the mother is the same, her look loving and tender as ever. When the child is to be weaned, the mother too is not without sorrow that she and the child grow more and more apart, that the child which first lay beneath her heart, yet later rested at her breast, should no longer be so close. Back in 2000, I was struck by how Johannes de Silencio was starting to sound more like Johanna de Silencio, as if the sacrifice were breaking out into something more like Julia Kristeva's Stabat Mater, or Luce Irigaray's Le corps à corps avec la mère. It was as if Johanna had just read and responded to Marcella Autus Reed's Indecent Theology, where she asks, why does feminist theology select the female gaze as a privileged place of discourse? Why not theology with women's hands, legs, breast or head or sex? The weaning mother and her child may well be layered shadowgraph projections of Soren's secreted relations with his father, his Michael, his former fiancée Regine, Anne, the mother and former housemaid, a Hagar mother figure. but they also surely have their origins in the uncanny mirroring between sacrifice and natality in the biblical texts. As a Christian against Christendom, opposed to what he calls the tight lacings of the spiritual corset of Christian doctrine, which he says turns men into geldings, surely Kierkegaard would have noticed and appreciated how these inconceivable scriptures burst out of anything that might be expected or certainly needed from a biblical text. I want to try to attempt what might be called a somatic exegesis of the sacrifice, that is, as Judah Goldin put it, at the center of the nervous system of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with the help of some images from Saskia Bodeker and Peter Greenaway's exhibition, Obedience, from Berlin in 2015. If you really read it, warns Johannes, you will fear and trembling. You will shake with a shudder of thought. Your brain will reel. You will be struck blind. You will suffer from the congestion of the blood. Oh, it's not working. That's it. You'll become sleepless. You'll feel the heat of perspiration. You will feel all the convulsions and concussions of existence. Yeah? Okay. And these are only some of the extreme symptoms that you can expect. Soren Johannes likes to talk up the pain, the health warning, the danger. But this is a text that also soothes, that changes sacrifice from blood to text. There is also the knife, but also the softness of angels' wings, wings made up of praying hands in a room lined with swan feathers. The text moves between something high and pure like metaphysics and something beyond or beneath, something far more fleshy, singular and concrete. God commands, take your son, your only son, and offer him as a whole burnt offering, leading Abraham on a journey up the mountain, up into the high and holy oneness. But at the same time, there's such a rude and raw insistence on what is going to happen to the body. With all the sang-froid of one preparing for a barbecue, Abraham takes the knife and fire in his hand and piles the wood on his son's back. And then, at the very last moment, the angel and the ram from the thicket to be offered instead of Isaac. Some midrashim say that the ram was also called Isaac. On the one hand, can you go back? That's all right. On the one hand, the hand on the knife, and on the other hand, the hand of the angel, both at once, neither negating the other. Sacrifice is turned into a sacrifice in scare quotes or shudder quotes. The act is not completed, but nor is it negated. It hangs eternally in the conflicted middle space. The productive power of the act, combined with the retraction or commuting of the act, feels a little like irony, where something is simultaneously affirmed and negated, said and unsaid. You can hear or feel the text as saying that this is something that Abraham would have done, and it's very good that he would have, and at the same time, that this is not something that he actually did. And it's also very good that he did not, though a different kind of good. So in our hands, on the table, on the piece of paper, is not a sacrifice, but a scripture about an aborted, transformed sacrifice. And this, I think, is crucial to our study of sacrifice beyond or beneath metaphysics. Sacrifice is so often a double movement, a reversible equation. It goes up, as in the noun olah, offering in Hebrew, from the verb to go up, turning the body into smoke and sending the smoke upwards towards the God, the hypergood, the Holy One, highlighted and set apart, saker fakare, as the one above all others, by this supreme offering of something precious, something that signifies loss, turning into smoke. But at the same time, On the other hand, and often at the same time, in the very same action, the same gesture, there is the transformation of rude, raw, crude, literal acts of sacrifice, and all that pain and harm to the body, in reverse acts of metaphorization, ethicization, textualization, transformation, qualification, even repudiation and denial. Blood sacrifices so often move between these two poles of abstraction and literalization in the quest to find which is greater or maybe safer in something like an interminable reversible equation. And crucially, this movement, this reversible equation, seems to go all the way down to the deep past, to the beginning, where it seems that they were already anticipating some of the questions of the workshop. What could be more exotically and obscurely past than the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible? And yet here, alongside all the archives of recipes for different kinds and types of sacrifice, all the documentation of the precise dimensions of the temple, filed in words in the filing cabinet of Scripture, we find the God of the Psalms asking, do I eat the flesh and blood, and drink the blood of goats? Do I really? And asserting that sacrifice did not pass through his mouth in two senses. He did not ever eat it, nor did he speak it. He was only ever speaking about the sacrifice of thanksgiving, sacrifice as prayer, or an offering of the cows of the lips. In acts of demystification and disenchantment long before the advent of modernity, sacrifices were being hastily rewritten as historical accidents, effects of mingling with the nations, or as God putting up with sacrifice rather than commanding it, to gradually wean his people off the sacrifices that they had become addicted to in Egypt, so turning blood sacrifice into something like God's temporary methadone clinic. In a process repeated over and over again, red turns to black. The blood of sacrifice turns into ink and prayers and philosophies and papers and conferences. But even though the sacrifice of Abraham is now only a paper scripture, an aborted sacrifice, an ink sacrifice, it still feels exactly like a sacrifice because it does what good sacrifices are supposed to do. It is productive, reproductive, miraculous. It turns death, thanatos, into life, zoe. Because you have done this, says the angelic messenger, done being in inverted commas, with what Abraham has done, shifting from a sacrifice to a not withholding, I will make a heaven full of sons like stars, and sons as numerous as the sand or dust of the land. Suns, so to speak, splattered across the sky like stars in the heavens, up above, in the skies, truly transcendent, but also down below. For the suns are also to be like the sand of the seashore and the dust of the land, down on the ground. Death becomes life. But also, equally miraculous and magical, in a series of alterations on the sacrificial altar, a boy becomes a ram and dust and stars and a whole people. And then, in the sequel, or prequel, in this preposterous Judeo-Christian history, a sign of the God who becomes man and wine and bread and lamb and priest and victim, all at the same time. In text and practice, sacrifice has been used as something like the most hair-raising fairground ride, the one called the altar. It's a place where man has held himself between the antipodes of being, between living and dying, but also between the species limits of bios, man, plant, animal, and divinity. In sacrifice, life can become pluripotent, like the early embryo. In sacrifice, we can live forever and become anything. Anything is possible. Any strange surrogacy, substitution, transformation, neither nor, and both and, chaos swirling, this mutating into that. Sacrifice is a place of fantasies of self-extension, self-amplification, and self-interrogation. Man giving himself alternative futures, making himself otherwise, but also making life suffer, feeling oneself falling and changing in the safe space of text and rite. The sacrifice of Isaac is also a nativity. Some interpretations highlight this by imagining Isaac as a little child, almost a baby, which also relates to the fact that, as we will see in a moment, in the chapter before he's sacrificed, he's only just been weaned. This is a story of a baby nation, a nascent nation, a people tracing their genealogy to the one father, the one sacrificed, creating through sacrifice. Sacrifice is birth done better, as Nancy J. would say. Hyperbirth. Male autogeneration without passing through the body of a woman. This explosive birth of a whole people from the almost wound of Isaac is even queerer than the caesarean section back in Eden, where the woman is extracted from the side gash in man and then called, as if to beg the question, mother of all living, and Chava, life. I've been at a birth, but only one, the birth of my quite beloved son, where I heard myself lowing like a cow, felt myself crossing the borders between the human, animal, and divine, a momentary goddess, albeit a goddess, slumped across the hospital floor. But I've never been to a sacrifice, I mean a real sacrifice, or an abattoir. Though I've spent so much of my career making papers about sacrifice, I've always been at the metaphorical, transformed, processed end of sacrifice, at the computer, at the lectern, with a pen, not a knife, in my hand. The closest I came to sacrifice in the nonconformist Protestant church of my childhood was eating little cubes of processed white bread and drinking tiny little glasses of blackcurrant juice from a wooden communion table underneath an empty, simple wooden cross with no body on it. And also presenting marrows and courgettes and various tins as Thanksgiving in Harvest Festival. I remember wondering as a child what God was going to do with these tins of baked beans and peas. So I was profoundly struck by the anthropologist Emmeline Coombs-Schilling's account of seeing and smelling and hearing the sacrifice of sheep at Eid al-Adha in Morocco, commemorating Ibrahim's sacrifice of Ishmael, which is also, of course, not simply a literal sacrifice, and also processed and transformed as text and charity, and what Abraham heard God telling him to do in a dream. It's impossible, she says, to see the red blood on the white wool and not feel the memory of the blood and afterbirth and mucus on the slithering, emerging child. Impossible not to hear the screams of the mother and the cries of the newborn in the sounds of the dying sheep that defy words and force you back into onomatopoeia. One important way of reading this foundational nativity scene of the birth of a nation through sacrifice is as the theft of natural reproduction, birth transformed into alienating supernatural technologies and structures. Let us show you how to do it, ladies. Mere birth between feces and urine is substituted by the complex, convoluted, and altogether queer sacrificial architecture of being born again, born better, rejuvenated, regenerated, and saved. There may be an Iphigenia and Jephthah's daughter, but Jephthah's daughter is no Isaac or Christ. The sacrifice of woman tends to be performed in one sense of the genitive and not the other. As Peggy McCracken argues, fathers and kings sacrifice because they are the ones who have children, socially and ritually speaking. And the power to sacrifice children anxiously consecrates this myth of the father as the one who fathers at the origin, after which the woman comes on in a secondary role to mother in the sense of nurture. A woman mother can only at most consent to child sacrifice because for her, the sacrifice of a child would be murder, because she lacks the powers of the denegation of murder as sacrifice. I'm sure Robert Yell will have a lot more to say on this tomorrow. Barrenness is gendered female. Women have children only as lack. They become the origin of the child only where there is lack. Man's heroic sacrifice adventures, the trials of the knights of faith, the tests of sacrificial blood, are set against menstrual blood. Do not go near a woman before you come close to the mountain. The women, particularly the women who are able to bear a child, must be far away, down there, over there, deep down in the flesh, off-site, off-page. None of this is untrue nor unimportant, but nor, I think, is it the whole truth. The relationships between sacrifice and birth are also more complex for at least two reasons. First, because sacrifice is a technology of lack. In an earlier article with the title Cutting Up Life, I looked at how sacrifice and the incessant movement and transformation that characterizes sacrifice relates to the precarious absence of man, suspended between a celestial and terrestrial nature, somewhere in the no man's land between animalplus and divinityminus, always more and less than himself. I argued that even as all those implements and altars and tabernacles and temples and all that delicate cuisine of sacrifice, all those very precise recipes for the filleting of the animal, assert the powers of man over and above the animal, which he lays out on the altar, sacrifice is also, like the myth of Prometheus or Adam, a statement about the uniqueness of man as nakedness and lack and deficit and need, hence sacrifices of thanksgiving, worship, atonement, sin and guilt. The second, related reason why I suspect a more complex relationship between sacrifice and birth lies in these strange old sacrifice stories, which, far from pushing birth away, seem to make the homologies between birth and sacrifice explicit. In fact, there seems to be a perverse attraction to what I'm calling surrogacy structures. Just as sacrifice is pluripotent like the embryo, with the powers to produce transformations of life from suns to stars to gods to lambs, constantly moving between the high and the holy and the flesh, the abstraction and the body, so it also produces queer, transgendered transformations. Whatever else contributed to Søren Kierkegaard's strange experiments with the weaning mother, one source surely was scripture. Genesis 22 is not alone, not the only, any more than Isaac is the only, or Abraham for that matter. I need to apologize to the, does that work? I need to apologize to the artists in the room for the quality of the visuals that are going to follow. You can see what I'm getting at, but I'm no artist. Rather like, if you go to that one, yeah, rather like the Grunewald altarpiece. Thank you. Genesis 22 is the central panel in a triptych, flanked by Genesis 21 and 23. Two mothers leaning in on the sacrifice, encroaching on it, birthing, weaning, dying, holding sons and nations in their arms, like a Pieta or a nativity, and close up on the text, not far away. Back behind the Koci translations, Genesis 21 opens with God visiting the postmenopausal Sarah, the barren non-mother, so that she conceives by visitation, divine IVF, seemingly bypassing the human father, giving birth to the inconceivable child, the one who comes from her womb like a big belly laugh, and who is called Yitzhak, he laughs. The text then opens into a pointed emphasis, which is strange, very strange, given the usual terseness of Hebrew narrative, on the weaning, suckling, nursing mother and her baby, the boy who is, in the very next chapter, destined to become the baby father of the nascent nation, here coming from Sarah's womb alone and being suckled at Sarah's breasts. And Bert, for this story, is anything but simple. Genesis 21 also makes it clear that there's already another son, the one made when Sarah commanded Abraham, "Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." leading to disturbing scenes of Sarah presenting a half-undressed Abraham with the draped alabaster body of Hagar, or Sarah peering in at the window as mother-in-waiting and jealous voyeur. Birth done better and birth done otherwise, like sacrifice, surrogacy structures. The slave woman Hagar was able to provide what God could not, or did not want to at that time. According to the divine promise, Abraham was to be the big daddy, Avram, mighty father, father of multitudes. But the human and divine fathers seem to lack even the modest power to get the story going. Given that the myth of Genesis could have narrated itself exactly as it wanted itself and its family and its origins to be, why this doubling, these awkward threes, these troubling scenes? Why not tell a simple story of monogenesis, a united family born of the single father? Surrogacies and doublings then multiply in this story of a nation that seems set on self-sacrifice and self-harm, barely being born and then putting itself under the knife. Hagar, whose name means resident alien, is a double for Abraham, who lives in the Promised Land, where he is now an alien. Because Sarah sees Ishmael yitzhacking, playing in Hebrew, but also being Isaac, threatening to become Isaac, she pushes the other son and the other mother out into the desert. But Hagar and Ishmael turn out to be textual surrogates too. And the story of their exile is narrated as a reverse exodus, with nascent Israel as the guilty party, and also a proleptic near sacrifice of the other only son. The mimicry of Israel's two watershed dramas, the birth of the nation on the altar and through the waters of the Red Sea, creates sympathy for the enslaved Egyptian other, and blame and guilt for the nation not yet born, but already in deficit, haunted by guilt and theft. The narrative surrogacies and substitutions come thick and fast, as if the story wants to harm itself with all this chaos and all these substitutions. The doubling exposes God's command to take the only in Genesis 22 as a metaphysical or theological lie, a ruse of purity and oneness. Oh, it's stopped again. When the son is saved by a miraculous well, not a ram in the desert, oh yeah, here we go. God repeats his promise to Hagar that he will so greatly multiply her offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. Go lift the child and hold him in your arms, because I shall make of him a great nation. Hagar as motherland, cradling the half-living, half-dying nation in her arms. Genesis 21 presents a Sarah nativity, a Hagar nativity, and a Hagar pieta, and sets the sacrifice of Isaac in relationships of debt and deficit to the two mothers. The debts multiply as in Genesis 23, the mother who suckled and weans now dies. And, or but, Sarah died. The word for and, the vav, is just a line in Hebrew and can be read as and or but. The rest of the chapter is a laborious description of how the great father, who's just been given the promised land and just birthed through sacrifice, sons as numerous as the dust of the land, has to negotiate and overpay for a grave-sized piece of Canaan, a cave in which to bury his wife. The massive overpayment hints at the father's lack and deficit in relation to both the people of the land and the dead mother-wife. What interpreters make of all this is at least as strange as Kierkegaard's Abraham variations. In early Jewish and Christian interpretation, the death of Sarah, the real death of Sarah, is read as collateral damage and a protest. But, or therefore, Sarah died from that very pain. This sacrifice would and could have only taken place over the mother's dead body. Her corpse stands for the refusal to accept the alchemy of the metaphysical, the metaphorical. Having its cake and eating it, so to speak, Genesis 22 hopes and prays that one can only kill a sheep in the end, and transform a metaphorized son sacrifice and still get all the reward. But in the death of Sarah, real death, real sacrifice returns in the flesh. Sacrifice can kill, even when it's turned into metaphor. Sacrifice hurts, really hurts. The sacrifice falls apart into discordant sounds, raw fears and emotions, just as in the Attunement section of Fear and Trembling. In Jewish tradition, Isaac is replaced by the ram, so that at most he only dies a little bit. And the sacrifice is commemorated not by actual sacrifice, but by blowing into a bit of the dead ram's body, the ram's horn or shofar, to make rich resonance noises that are at once a wailing, a mourning, a sound of victory, a call to arms, and a cry for aid. In Midrash Tanhuma, God says to Abraham, when your descendants are in trouble in the future, they should blow on the horn of a ram like this one, and I remember what you were ready to do for me, and I will save them. But then Leviticus Rabbah says that you can also hear in the sounds of the ram's horn the mother Sarah's screams. Pre-modern Christian interpretation works in the space between the secret, in the higher typological sense, and the lower sense, keeping secrets from people who really should be told, setting up profound discords and sometimes harmonies between the typological and the metaphysical, and the suffering body down low, here on earth, where all the poor existing individuals live. One of the most striking examples can be found in a 15th century mystery play, the Dublin Northampton Abraham on the Handouts. When Isaac's on the altar, he pleads, "Can't your king be satisfied by any other kind of beast?" And then he invokes the mother as protection. "Is this what you've told my mother?" To which Abraham replies, "She, Mary's son, Christ forbid." The lower comic and blasphemous sense is, "Christ, no. Good God, no. I couldn't possibly tell her. Are you mad?" But the expletive is also pious, an expression of the secret in the higher sense, because typologically Isaac is Mary's son Christ. Isaac's consent is strange and full of laughter, turning the original sacrifice, which is comic in the technical sense of a happy ending, into hilarious dissonance. "Father, do whatever you desire, but I know full well that my mother shall miss me. Many times she has embraced and kissed me, but farewell to all that, for that is now over. She used to call me her treasure and her store, but farewell to all that, she shall say this no more. Here I shall be killed, without knowing wheretofore, except that God must have his desire. Father, will you also be chopping off my head?" When Abraham returns and tells Sarah what he was prepared to do, she says, "Alas, where was your minder?" And he replies, "My mind was on God on high." But then he says he's sorry, just as Kierkegaard fantasized. In poignant Syriac liturgical poems written for Easter, Sarah's heart groans as she catches the son and father sneaking out. She confronts Abraham. "Why are you sharpening your knife? Who do you intend to slaughter with it? This secret today, why have you hidden it from me? Where are you taking my only begotten? Where is the child of my vows off to?" Abraham tells Sarah he's going to slaughter a sheep, but Sarah is skeptical. Her rejoinder is shocking. "If it's a sheep you're wanting to see to, then be off and see to the sheep and return. Leave the child behind, lest something happen, and untimely death meet him. For I'm being unjustly deprived of the single son to whom I've given birth. You are so drunk with the love of God, who is your God and my God, that if he so bids you concerning the child, you would kill him without hesitation." Sarah is terrified by the intense fervour for which moderns would invent new words such as fanaticism or radicalisation. Abraham has lost his senses. He's behaving as if drunk. He would do anything for God. And there are many tones to the statement, Abraham would do anything for God. And then when Sarah's fully convinced that Isaac has been sacrificed, her mourning speech is poignant and extremely tactile. I was wishing I was an eagle or had the speed of a turtle dove, so that I might go and behold that place where my only child, my beloved, was sacrificed, that I might see the place of his ashes and see the place of his binding, and bring back a little of his blood to be comforted by its smell. I was wishing I had some of his hair to place inside my clothes, so that when grief overcame me, I could place it over my eyes. I wished I could see his pyre and the place where his bones were burnt, and could bring a little of his ashes and gaze on them always to be comforted. The mother imagines binding herself to the corpse of Isaac, swaddling herself with the son, melding and merging with him. The smell of his blood inside her nostrils, his hair inside her clothes and laid on her eyes, gazing on his burnt bones and ashes always. In the ongoing transformations and surrogacies of sacrifice, the mother becomes the son, dies like the son, and takes his body inside, as if back inside her womb. An Easter sermon by Pseudo-Chrysostom imagines that if Sarah had known of the sacrifice, she would have done anything to save her son, even, if possible, wrapping him back up in her womb to hide him. For as he comments, women are in such cases very emotionally involved. In these Syriac poems, the mother's near death and grievous pain at her separation from her beloved son becomes central to the poem, and Sarah is transfigured into Mary as Mater Dolorosa. Because of the suffering of his mother, in your compassion, give us what we ask. And finally, the most consistently transgendered sacrifice is the 6th century Byzantine poet Romanos Melodos's liturgical poem for the fourth Sunday in Lent. Amplifying the already piercing and pointed command in Genesis 22, Romanos' God tells Abraham, "Take the child of your body, the very child that you received as consolation in your old age, and for my honor, cut his throat." And the poet comments, "Oh, what pain for him in these words. God did not say simply your child. A single word did not suffice. He wanted to call his very bowels or compassion to revolt. For he alone is the saviour of our souls." The compassionate insides of Abraham are already turning into the womb of Sarah, womb and compassion being related, even before the poem breaks out into an ingenious use of ethopoeia, or hypothetical speech. "Why did you not say," says the poet, before giving several passionate stanzas full of what Abraham emphatically did not say, but could have and maybe even should have. Abraham's strong Kierkegaardian words include, "Why did you give me the title of father, master, and not the assassin of my child? Because I won't have been called father for very long, but for eternity I will be proclaimed the murderer of my child. For he alone is the saviour of our souls. And those who will see me cut my son's throat, what will they take me for? For a madman or a lost spirit? And he whose swaddling clothes I am wrapped or unbound, shall I bind him in order to kill him? He whom I watch playing or frolicking, praising you for having given him to me, he whom I nursed, I cannot be his assassin, because he alone is the saviour of our souls. And, alas, my flesh, your infant babbling will be made mute by your father's hand as he cuts your throat, because he alone is the saviour of our souls." Not only does this Abraham seem to have got hold of an advanced copy of Fear and Trembling, but he appears to be turning into Sarah. In the Bible, it's Sarah who watches Isaac playing, Sarah who's remembered for her laughter, Sarah who nurses and swaddles and weans. And then Sarah overhears Abraham's unspoken words and breaks out into furious speech, turning into screams. "Get away from me immediately. I'm taking him in my arms, this child who caused so much pain in my belly, because I want to have my fill of him. And leave the child with me, old man, he's mine. When he has called you, willed it, he will let me know. He announced to me by his angel, my son's coming into the world. He will surely let me know if he wants his blood. I don't entrust the child to you. I don't give him to you, because he alone is the saviour of our souls. The coda of salvation now feels like a repudiation of Abraham and an affirmation of the divine sovereign who saves the son and the mother from the father. God the sovereign and Abraham the father split. Condemning Abraham as torturer and executioner, Sarah categorically refuses to be the chief mourner in the funeral entourage for the son whom her husband has killed. Echoing across the centuries, the 6th century Sarah anticipates all the contemporary anti-war and anti-sacrifice protesters who restage the story as a drama of child protection and imagine Mama Sarah bringing Isaac back down from Mount Moriah. Romanes's Sarah protests that the mutiny of Abraham's belly or compassion is as nothing compared with the mutiny of her belly, which is far more intimately, umbilically bound to the son. The little life which I have left, I want to live it with him. If Isaac is killed, will she have to conceive once more, suckle once more, and then when the fruit is ripe, give it back to God once more, one more son? Sacrifice is easy, birth is hard. It's relatively easy and quick to take a knife to a son and kill him. It takes 9 months and so much courage and labour and so much nurture to make another. Separation from Isaac will kill her. She will forever mourn the sight that she will never see, the tears that will never be shed, Isaac's tears over her death. Addressing a phantom Isaac, she hopes and prays in prayers as transformation of sacrifice, that they will both die of natural causes, son after the mother, and that you will close my eyes, you who, along with your children, will return me to the bosom of my fathers, and that you will come to cry for me on the bed where you first saw the light. It's impossible to read or feel these strange scriptures, these biblical texts, and these strange afterlives and after deaths without experiencing a sense of ourselves as natals, at least as much as mortals, and without feeling that somehow sacrifice is an indebted, pale, and bloody imitation of birth, as the miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs from its normal, natural ruin, in the words of Hannah Arendt. Both structures defy death simplicitas and proclaim that once called into existence, human life cannot simply turn into nothingness or simply go up in smoke. Both are experiences of omnipotence and powerlessness, bursts of creativity, new beginnings, but also profound fragility at the very edges of human life and being and becoming. Acutely so in cultures where to give birth may very well be to die, to give one's life for the child. In birth, one does not know who or what is coming. In that sense, all births are messianic. Isaac's inconceivable birth, out on a limb, a wing, and a prayer, followed by that extreme yes, and all the profound alterations in life around the sacrificial altar, remind me of, and rhyme with, Nietzsche's quasi-scriptural proclamation or enunciation that the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, a sacred yes is needed. I say unto you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Yvonne, for sharing your lecture with us. And not only a lecture, but also a multitude of images. I am going to present one more, actually, which is right here on the small table. This image is physically here. I am sorry for being obsessed with the physicality, but it's it's tonight's hallmark. This particular image was painted and gifted to me by Daniel Domik last year, approximately a month later after the birth of my daughter Ida. And I invite you to take a closer look at the image following the lecture. The image is titled "The Theologian." And as I gazed upon this image for the first time, my mind began to race with questions. What does the theologian represent within this artwork? Is she the nurturing mother, struggling to provide the best for her child? Is the theologian the infant, laboring to extract nourishment from the breast to satiate itself and promote growth and development? Is the theologian the intermediary, the breast, facilitating nourishment to the baby? There are no definitive answers to these questions, and I appreciate the idea that all of these interpretations may be valid. The theologian may embody the roles of mother, child, and breast simultaneously, similarly to the Attunement, where Abraham finds himself in the role of the breast as well. These contemplations have led me to Kierkegaard's Attunement, which was presented to us tonight by Yvonne, to the image of the weaning mother and the metaphor of weaning as sacrifice. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow's paper of Cecilia, who will talk about this metaphor in the Attunement, not as a mere metaphor, but as the embodied experience as well. In her contribution to Present and Future of Biblical Studies, titled Grammars of Sacrifice, Futures, Subjunctives, and What Would Have or Could Have Happened on Mount Moriah, Yvonne Sherwood, having Derrida's interpretation cited by me before, the whole time on the table, I am sure, decided to play with the Akeda in a different way. She emphasizes not silence and secrecy, but exactly the opposite. What would or could have happened if Abraham did not keep it secret, or if the information about the Olah, the whole burnt offering, has slipped away, particularly to Sarah's ears. Mediation plays a crucial role here, because everything that Yvonne refers to is only possible because in the end, the event was not a secret between God and Abraham. Yvonne draws from numerous extra-biblical texts, rabbinical commentaries, early Christian commentaries, as well as later literary interpretations, all of which explore the question of what might have transpired if Sarah had known. Mieke Ball, in her question about the feminist agenda in Derrida's contribution cited before, makes reference to a related story in Judges 19. This is the infamously known story about the Levite's concubine who was gang raped and then cut into 12 pieces by her husband master and sent to the 12 tribes of Israel as an evidence of what had occurred to her. In this context, the transmission of specific body parts sent to the 12 tribes of Israel played a crucial role, serving to reveal the heinous act and seeking justice. This form of mediation and transmission was inherently deadly embodied. Drawing from today's lecture and discussing surrogacy structures, motherhood, and patriarchy, while referencing Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham, I am considering all of them as embodied mediators on multiple levels and at different times. Abraham embarked on a journey to the land that God will show him, in Genesis 12:7, to mediate God's faithfulness for us. His body undergoes challenges of the journey. This mediation occurs once again in Genesis 22, when God commands him to sacrifice his beloved son. Sarah acts as the mediator of God's miracle, the surrogate/mediator. And please keep in mind that there are no sterile men in the Hebrew Bible. It's only barren women. And you Yvonne, make a beautiful wordplay with Akera being barren and Akeda, the binding of Isaac. Together with Hagar's surrogacy, they provide a temporary solution for the miraculous birth of Isaac before he is again miraculously reborn in the Akeda. It is important to note that Hagar's surrogacy is not an isolated act. It's part of Sarah's surrogacy, which is meant to mediate the promise given to Abraham and the entire Israelite people. This means that Hagar's surrogacy is twofold. She is surrogating for Sarah's surrogating. The process of surrogacy, including this dual surrogacy, exacts a toll on the female body, resulting in a painful experience for both Sarah and Hagar. Their bodies endure pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, only to later be required to part from their children, leaving them with numerous physical and emotional scars. A similar dynamic, however, I would say applies to Abraham as well. He also serves as a surrogate for delivering God's message to Israel, and he often finds himself in situations when he is quite uncertain if the promises were being withheld. And now, when I have already confused the roles and gender in the debate, I will continue with a few questions. Sarah and Hagar are celebrated figures in feminist biblical scholarship. The former is associated with more or less white Anglo-American scholarship, while the latter is a key figure in Afro-American and Latino scholarship. Both Sarah and Hagar, despite their unique roles, exhibit moments of disdain towards each other during their pregnancies, bearing the burden of patriarchal influence, as pointed out by Derrida in Faith and Knowledge. This leads me to reconsider all the mediations and surrogacies. Given that Abraham has got a hard time from many feminist scholars, including Yvonne here, by juxtaposing the murderer and the loving mother, I am pondering whether we should also examine the masculinities within Sarah and Hagar, and perhaps, in light of their complexities, readmit Abraham in the gender studies on embodied sacrifice, and call her maybe together with Ona Eisenstadt the Bartleby Abraham, who is also quite wandering all the time. So my first question to Yvonne would be, shall we reconsider Abraham from this point of view of being maybe more gender unstable and not being always the considerate murderer? Then the second question would be, you mentioned during the lecture that mothers cannot sacrifice, that they only murder. And I have two examples. I brought up two examples, and you may comment upon them. And this is the mother in the second Maccabees who sends her 5 children to the war, or Medea sacrificing her children and cooking them for her unfaithful husband Jason. Mm-hmm. So are these going back to what Derrida, this is in my knowledge his only comment on gender or gender roles, and this is the occurrence in Faith and Knowledge, saying that there is the sting of phallus in pregnancy being kind of masculine aspect of motherhood, and this kind of oppressive character going out. If these two mothers, and Sarah included, are bearing also the share of toxic masculinities, as we call them today. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, those are fascinating questions. I mean, I think as I wrote this talk, I was struck more and more with the way the roles of the mother and the father collapse into one another. So the text, I mean, interestingly enough, I think it's Hagar who's most like Abraham. So the mimesis, the way that he's described as a resident alien, she's described as a resident alien, that's already there in the text. And then so many of these later interpretations conflate the insides of Abraham with the insides of Sarah. He talks about his womb. I think that the Romanos text is particularly striking for that. So on one hand, I think that there is a very sharp distinction between the role of the father and the role of the mother around sacrifice and barrenness. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that this collapse is something that the scriptural texts are doing, and then that certainly the interpretive traditions are playing with. So yeah, I think that Abraham is very feminine and maternal, and that the women are also, I mean, Hagar is the most quasi-patriarchal figure in the whole of the Hebrew Bible. Now, why do that with an Egyptian slave? I think that's striking. I can't think of any origin story that harms itself or doubles itself to that extent. So why is, you know, when you've got the first father, why not tell a simple story about the first father? Okay, have a sacrifice if you need to have a sacrifice, but why make it so complicated with all this doubling of everything? So yeah, I think you're exactly right, and also that there is a weakness in Abraham. There is a lack in Abraham, you know, right from the beginning. It's Sarah who tells him to expel the slave.
Yeah, he's prostituting his wife twice because he's afraid of the king. So this is quite a non-patriarchal.
Absolutely.
If you have, if you want to add something, or we may open the floor to the questions, because I think that it's about the time. We have a few questions. Please take the microphone, if you will. Thank you.
Sorry. So I wanted to go back to this distinction in several moments of both the lecture and your comment were there. Is there a difference between a surrogate and a medium? And isn't, you know, because when you started with Derrida's model of language, so we definitely would say it's not a surrogate but a medium. But a woman's body is taken as a surrogate, as a material object. And I think it might be interesting to follow this line for a moment. So why is it that Sarah's speeches, so to say, are read entirely as kind of exclamatory, expressive cries, so to say, and not in the sense of a mediated message? So, I mean, I'm interested in this concept because when we reinterpret these things, and I have seen the Greenaway exhibition, and I thought it's much more about, you know, disobedience, because this is what is tested, the capacity of disobedience and not of obedience. Obedience would be the bad norm. And so is Sarah in this frame the super norm? Because she is, I mean, staying with the idea of life as a kind of supreme value, so to say. And Abraham would then be already somebody who is disobedient. So all this changes, I think, the moment you switch between this idea, what is the medium and what is the surrogate. And so why are women there seen as surrogates, but not as media? So is it repeating this lack of symbolic power, so to say?
Would you like to respond? Or?
Yeah, I'm not sure I had a good response. I mean, I'll say why I use surrogacy. I use surrogacy because I wanted to talk about all those strange homologies between the birth and the sacrifice, so that because it was, you know, and I wanted to use the embodied figure of surrogacy, the baby born by another. And I wanted to use that in contrast to the sort of the hyperbirth of sacrifice. I don't think I've got a good answer to what you're asking about mediation. I'm not quite sure I've got a helpful way of talking about that distinction. So to say, I just wanted to kind of, use that surrogacy structure and then also overlay that on the sacrifice and the kind of, what's happening with the body and the way that different bodies are taken into other bodies, and that there becomes a far less clear distinction than you would expect. And I was also very interested in the end, with how so many of those texts are almost like, it is something onomatopoeic or something like a scream or something like something sort of not verbal. It's like a howl. It's not an argument. It's a howl. So, and I thought there was something. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at with the whole sort of surrogacy question. But I think it's a really interesting question. I'm sorry I don't have a better way of responding to it at the moment. Maybe tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I would only add that I followed up on the Nancy J. and your own approach of sacrifice being the birth done better. Therefore, already Sarah has to surrogate, for the message to be conveyed, in a sense. Whereas when I spoke about Judges 19, I did not speak about surrogacy, but about the mediation of the cat bodies that were distributed, and were speaking for the event that has taken place. Yeah.
I mean, actually, I thought more in the context of Kierkegaard's notion of repetition. So is a surrogate something that looks for repetition, that with Kierkegaard we say it's not possible? So it will be always something new. So one can ask, is it possible to think about giving birth as a kind of surrogate? Or is it a contradiction to the notion, the Arendtian and the Kierkegaard notion of repetition as opening a new cycle?
Yeah. So by surrogacy, I don't mean. I wasn't, in a way I was wanting to sort of stay close to these texts and just kind of talk about these different texts in their own idioms and just sort of in a way lay them on the altar, put them on the table. And I hadn't really sort of gone so far as to, the whole concept of natality is sort of like breaking out of the repetitious chain of begats and the sort of the seasonal crop. It's about something new. It's about a new beginning. It's about an opening. There's no repetition in birth and natality. It's never a repetition. A surrogacy is a kind of, well, I haven't really, to be honest, haven't really theorized or thought very hard about what might be entailed in the concept of surrogacy. To be honest, it just kind of lent itself to me from the text. But I think it's very interesting because it's the offering of another. The two bodies are involved in the one child. It's potentially very interesting. I just haven't really thought it through, but definitely not a sense of just merely standing in for or repeating what could have happened otherwise. But it's something, I was getting at this sort of like these new bursts of beginning, and the way that these texts are all trying to get at that through the surrogacy, through the birth, through the doubling of the son, then through the sacrifice. In a way, they're opposed. And in a way, they're similar. There's a repetition, mimesis between the birth stories and the sacrifice stories. They're trying to break it open into something incredible, something worthy of life, something powerful, something that's not just a continuation of more of the same.
I think we have a good example of surrogacy denying repetition already in the story of Hagar and Sarah, because when Hagar conceived and Sarah saw that it's not completely a surrogacy, that the child is not going to be hers anyway, and Hagar is despising her mistress, and then Sarah expels her when she conceives herself, when she herself conceives, and then I mean from the modern witnesses of surrogacy and being done either legally or non-legally, we have surrogate mothers denying to give the child to the parents because they just they feel them as their own. So I would agree that it kind of denies repetition in this sense.
Yeah.
Hello, and thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I have actually two questions. One is if you maybe perhaps came across a representation, I have it here on my phone actually. It's one from the Sarajevo Haggadah, and it's one of the oldest Sephardic Haggadahs in the world. And it's from the mid-14th century, and it's called actually The Binding and Sacrifice of Isaac. I think it's a quite interesting representation. It's not so dramatic, so I can actually show you that later on. It looks quite interesting. Just in terms of representation, I would be interested maybe tomorrow, or I don't know, when you have time, just for your kind of thinking about this, what does this represent? And the other question was more like, do you think that this Sarah, we just assume how she actually might have felt, because her role is quite interesting, because she's all the time faced through the whole narrative of the Bible. She's actually sacrificing everything, doesn't she? She leaves the home, she goes with Abraham, then she's supposed to, she kind of finds a surrogate mother, and she becomes a surrogate mother, then she's not. Then she's supposed to, kind of, she feels that she is about to sacrifice her son, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But in any case, it's a kind of, Sarah is an interesting person to me, and as a metaphor for all mothers, or I don't know, for the lack of the better word, metaphor or whatever, representing an idea of a mother, and her kind of political connotation of Sarah today. And the third, do you think that this story ends the meaning of sacrifice as it was before Abraham? I know that there is sacrifice throughout the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. I know there is a sacrifice that repeats, like the animal sacrifice as a part of the, sacrificing to God something, but it's different, like not in terms just of human sacrifice, but of the meaning of sacrifice in itself. Is this the point when the story is reversed, or is it just with the sacrifice of Christ when we have the complete, or is this the beginning? Because it looks to me like the beginning. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, loads of really good questions. I think so. Before this sacrifice, you have Noah's sacrifice at the end of the flood, and then that is one of the most beautifully, or at least in one version of the story, one of the most beautifully anthropomorphic images of God who inhales the smell of sacrifice. It's kind of, I don't know if anybody had the Bisto gravy advert where, you sort of imagine the God with nostrils loving the smell of sacrifice, but not actually eating the sacrifice. So it's already at one remove, but enjoying the smell of it. And then you also have, I think rather than thinking of it as a progression, to think of it as every sacrifice has a kind of metaphorization or a repudiation or a softening. And this one obviously is a very stark example of you have your sacrifice, but you also make it into a metaphor at the same time, or you also substitute a ram. But then, you know, actually talking of, I don't know if it's, oh no, the thing's off. But there were, at the end I had an image from a prayer book where you were saying about the striking image in the Sarajevo Haggadah, where the Abraham stands, the son is alive, but the knife is blood red at the same time. So Isaac is killed and Isaac is not. And a lot of Midrashim do this. They have the ram called Isaac. So Isaac as the ram dies, but Isaac as the boy lives. So it really plays with that tension of having your sacrifice and also not. And I think that's going on in so many of these texts. Even say that earlier sacrifice where, you know, God inhales the smell of it. It's already, God is not eating it. It's already a kind of, it's wanting to get away from the graphic rawness, but it's also, we're so impressed by the gift of a body. You know, a metaphor is not enough. So it's trying to do both of those things at the same time. And on your other point about Sarah, I just think how bizarre that you have that story framed by all those images of her suckling and nursing, which is, you know, details you don't normally get in the Hebrew Bible. And then all that long description about her burial. So you could say that interpretation makes Abraham's guilt, but I think it's kind of there. It's kind of, yeah, this is the one. This is the one. Yeah, so Abraham's. So the son is alive, but the knife is also red. And Philo says, you know, I gave him back to his father, and on account of his blood, I chose them. And there's a lot of playing with Isaac sheds a quarter of his blood, or he's wounded but not killed. So he sort of lives and he sort of dies. Yeah, but I'd love to see the image.
May I? Yvonne, thanks for the talk first. You say the sacrifice of women is at the heart of sacrifice, right? Now, what we were dealing with in your talk and what we are generally dealing with is always the one iconic, the unsurpassed example, at least in the Jewish Christian context. This is always the Isaac-Abraham story. There's many others, but this is the one, the unsurpassed, the super sacrifice story. I do not say this because I sense a contradiction here, not at all, because I understand you mean it in a very different sense. And I mean, it's the logic of the sacrifice that you're referring to, and the logic of the sacrifice is a logic that is about the sacrifice of women. And I think the way to maybe try to sum it up shortly is maybe that it is the inversion of birth, that it is this relationship of sacrifice and birth, and that this is actually maybe the deepest layer of why to say that sacrifice is about the sacrifice of women. My question is simply, if this is the logic of sacrifice, how to break that logic of sacrifice? What is a promising attempt to break it? I think you have maybe mentioned a few examples already in your talk or hints, but I really would want to maybe pin it down to this. What is the attempt to break the logic of sacrifice? One very interesting phrase I found in the readings that we all got from you, a passage that you did not quote. You have this Syriac liturgical poems, and in this one, Sarah says, once she becomes aware that actually it did not happen, Isaac has survived, it did not happen, he is alive, but this is, I find it a very strong saying when she says, from now on you should not be called Abraham's son any longer. Isn't that, for example, one way of breaking that logic? I think this is exactly what the sacrifice is about. Yeah. And if this claim of the father, that his son will always be connected to him, if this claim is broken, that's maybe one of the strongest countermeasures.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, really good questions. I think you're right when you say there are women who sacrifice. There are. And we always talk about Iphigenia and Jephthah's daughter also. But, you know, Derrida's phrase, the sacrifice of women, in one sense of the genitive or the other, I think it's usually one and not the other. It's usually the woman as the victim on the altar, the daughter who's sacrificed. There are exceptions to this. So there is that strong mythology that the father has the power. But I think that even in, you know, the scriptural tradition, let alone the interpretation that comes afterwards, that's already being questioned. That's already being disturbed. As for breaking the sacrificial logic, in a way I think it's more dangerous when you have the idea that you could just have a metaphor and it still be productive, that it's the family that kind of is prepared to kill itself, put itself under the knife, that is therefore blessed. This idea that somehow letting blood, even if it's blood, is somehow productive or creative. I mean, the one that most moved me at the end was the one from Romanos Melodos, where the mother is saying, you know, sacrifice is easy, birth is hard, you know, it's easy to destroy. So I think there's a lot of images here that you can use against sacrifice. How you break that mythology, it seems to be so potent, even when it's transformed, that somehow there is a productivity to the shedding of blood, that life is in the blood, and it's the higher the thing that you sacrifice also, the more productive the sacrifice, you know. And it's not a theoretical question in context of war, and where the giving of blood, the more people who are slain, the more people who are killed, it's somehow, this contributes to the mythology of nations, and it seems to be hardwired into our mythologies. And against that, these texts have screams, they have, you know, these cries of how difficult it is to produce life, to nurture life, to create life, to protect life. Yeah, that to me seems very powerful, but yeah, I don't know how you break. Were you saying at the end that the idea that he's no longer your son because you sacrificed him? There are so many. I'm sure a lot of people know. There's lots of interpretations where Isaac abandons the father after this. He will have nothing to, or there's a midrash where he goes to the Garden of Eden to be healed by the angels, you know, from the wounds that he suffered. Or there's, you know, not just in modern interpretation, ancient interpretation, you have Isaac and the father separated from one another, which is another intergenerational war story, that we have the sons protesting against the fathers who have sacrificed them, and the daughters.
Let me do a slight remark to the lady who was asking sacrifice before Abraham and after. From the Jewish point of view, it's quite easy, I would say, because before Abraham, the peoples in the world were sacrificing human beings. And the Akedah is the easiest way to show to the public, okay, we are stopping with that. We're not sacrificing human beings anymore. So this is one issue. The second issue, sorry, I came late. I'm not sure whether the core meaning of sacrifice in Jewish the interpretation is known. This korbanot simply means that this is a means to bring you closer to God, nothing more. I don't want to demystify it. It's a simple and easy way of bringing you closer to God. That's the reason why after the destruction of the second temple, it was quite easy, because the sacrifices couldn't perform anymore, to internalize them from a sacrifice to a prayer.
I would say in response, I think it's very hard to read the Akedah as a repudiation of child sacrifice. That it's, earlier I was saying it's double-handed. So it says it's good that Abraham would have done this. He is rewarded for being prepared to do that. But it's also stopped at the last minute, so it's also good that he didn't. But that's the tension. I mean, Kierkegaard is all over this tension, but it's really thinkers like Kant who say, a God worthy of the name cannot command slaughter. If a God utters a command that's contrary to the moral law, there can be no such God. And one response to that is to make the only gods that we valorize obedient to the ethical law as we understand it. Another response is to allow the God, and it's not just the God, it's also the nation, or also other things that can command sacrifice, that special power above the law. And I think the haunting, this is why this story is so disturbing, because it doesn't repudiate child sacrifice, nor does it allow a simple child sacrifice to happen. It does both. It wants to have its cake, as we say in English, and eat it at the same time. Have its sacrifice and not. And it's precisely that, I think, that's so haunting about it. And you'll never find a nation commanding sacrifice and, just embracing raw sacrifice. You'll never find, there's always that kind of double movement, which makes it sort of more acceptable. But it is the raw and the cooked. It's the sacrifice and the transformation that I think is powerful and disturbing.
And we had the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter in Judges 11, which went to the end, and she was sacrificed, and Jephthah is praised for his faith as well, for sacrificing her.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I think if there are no more questions, I think we came to the end. So I would like to thank Yvonne Sherwood again for her wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And we may refresh ourselves with some wine and cheese in the IWM cafeteria and continue with our probably informal discussions about sacrifice and beyond.